David, for taking us back through some episodes in EU history, or European Community history, or indeed EEC history, as it was at one time. I am going to kick off with one or two questions, but I would like to open it up as soon as I can. So, and I think there is a right you're going to do a roving microphone, which will help. But let me start with one thing, because of where I come from, since I'm actually a journalist. The atmosphere that you touched on, and the difference between now and 74, 75, I agree with what you were implying, which is that I think there was rather more sympathy for the Wilson government that came in February 74 and what it was trying to do than there seems to be now for what David Cameron may set out on Wednesday, generally in the continent. And I think there probably was a recognition that the terms of accession were somewhat slanted against the UK in 72, 73, and that a Labour attempt to try and improve them wasn't totally unreasonable. But one of the other things that people like to draw attention to in the case of the referendum was that, of course, the referendum, at the beginning of the process, it was said that there was a two-thirds majority against remaining in the European EEC. And during the campaign, that was translated into a two-thirds majority in favour. So it's going to be easy to do it again. But among the things that are different now, it seems to be, one is that the Euro crisis has diminished the view that I think many people in Britain felt in the 70s, which was that the club that we had just joined, and we were seeking to remain a member of, was a rather successful club. It was doing rather well economically, and the UK was doing rather badly. That's gone. But the other difference is that, of course, the press is much more hostile, and I think probably the elements in the Tory party that are more Eurosceptical are also much more hostile to continuing membership. Do you think that's true, and do you think that would make a big difference?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the situation with the press in the 1970s was, if I had been, the phrase had not been coined then of Eurosceptic, but if I had been campaigning for the no vote, I would have complained bitterly that the press was really stacked against the no campaign. There was, I think, one tabloid, if I remember rightly, that was for the no campaign, probably the Daily Express, but I'm not wrong either. And there was absolutely nothing else. All the broadsheets were in favour of staying in. The BBC was in favour of staying in. It was a completely different situation. So it was very unbalanced, just as the present situation is also very unbalanced in the opposite sense, and has, of course, been going on for a rather long time. So that does, I think, affect matters. I would agree with you about the attitude of the other member states. There is nothing similar to the feeling in the 1970s that Britain had got a bit of a raw deal in the accession negotiations. Indeed, I think most member states think that Britain has negotiated rather successfully in the last 15 years, and that things like the single market and enlargement and freer and fairer world trade and so on are as much as anything anywhere else made in London. At any rate, they've always been championed by London. So what's the fuss about? You hear people in Paris or Berlin saying, you've got everything you want, what is the fuss about? So I think it is very different, although I think a great deal of caution has to be taken in interpreting what people choose to put in even excellent journals like yours, John, because, as is well known, all diplomats are born in their cradles manipulative. And that's their profession. And so what is said is often designed to be read for effect. So I think a little care has to be taken, but I do broadly agree with you.
And one other thing I would like to just ask your view on is, as you said, in the 70s it was the Labour Party, and then of course it was Michael Foot in 83, and now it is the Conservative Party. I wonder if you have any thoughts on why it switched from large chunks of the Labour Party being very hostile to this enterprise, and now the Labour Party being broadly satisfied with it, to the Conservatives who were very strongly in favour in the 70s and in the 80s, to having a large group of them who are now very hostile. Why is this change happening?
It's very difficult. I'm sure any number of volumes are going to be written on this when the political history of the second half of the 20th century is written. I mean, sometimes I'm led to feel rather desperately that it must be some kind of contagious disease, and that somehow the Conservatives managed to contaminate, the Labour Party managed to contaminate the Conservatives with this dreadful fever. But of course that's silly. It's not like that. I think some of the rhetoric that Mrs. Thatcher deployed in order to get a budget deal and thereafter has, in what are called Thatcher's children, who are of course the Eurosceptics or Europhobes of today, had an effect which has borne no relation whatsoever to the objectives she herself was pursuing. Because the public record is perfectly clear, whether you're looking at what she said in the 75 referendum campaign or what she said in the Bruges speech. It was absolutely clear that she had absolutely no time for playing Russian roulette with British membership. That was not what she was about. And she might have extremely strong views about people who were overpaid and over there in the Commission or the Council or the Court of Justice. But she never, for 1 minute, you will not find a single word that she ever said that bears any resemblance to what several ministers have said in the last few weeks, that Britain might leave. She never said that. She never intended to let it happen. So the attitudes that are now taken up by what are called Thatcher's children are actually a very long way away from the things that she herself was aiming for. And people often, when they look at her record, and that's partly because she is such a polarizing personality, tend to misrepresent. She's not immune to having misrepresented herself, since she, to my knowledge, she has said in one of her latest books, her last book I think, that she didn't really know what the Single European Act was going to produce. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, having stood beside her, talking to her, the night before she concluded the negotiations in Luxembourg, that is simply not true. She knew perfectly well, and she wanted it to happen because, quite rightly, she saw the Single European Act as the key to a more competitive, freer labour market type of Europe that she wanted to see.
Very good. I called Brian's eye. Please would you just remind people who you are, and I do know everybody.
Brian Crowe, former British diplomat and Eurocrat. Thank you, David, for that, as always, illuminating talk. Just one observation, another difference between then and now was that then we were among the poorest countries in the European community, and so we're fighting back, because we couldn't afford to pay. That situation is now rather different because we can afford to pay, at least in terms of relative GDP per head among the 27 member states. One factor which it seems to me is never mentioned, which seems to me nonetheless very true, is that although obviously we were responsible for our own destiny back in the 50s, in electing then not to go to Messina, or went to Messina at a low level, but not to join the European community as it developed, and therefore we weren't at the negotiating table when the CAP and the other policies were being worked out. Nonetheless, the existing six, and more particularly the French, imposed quite consciously really tough terms, both in the CAP, which was of course a central part of the French interest, so perhaps they can be forgiven for that, but knowing that this would be anathema to the UK, but more particularly the common fisheries policy, which was put together very cynically on the eve of our accession on a take it or leave it basis, knowing that it would cause lasting unpopularity in the UK, which of course it has done, and I think we live with the consequences of that to this day. So although we were at fault, so were some of our partners, and notably the French, with a legacy that was left behind by that accession negotiation. John mentioned the UK press as a difference between now and then. The press was in favour, and you confirmed that. It isn't now. Another thing that seems to me possibly different is that although Callaghan and Wilson were determined that the unity of the Labour Party should be their priority, nonetheless these were the people who, before Ted Heath, had worked very actively for us to join the European Community. They launched negotiations at least twice. Well, anyway, launched negotiations and been vetoed again by de Gaulle. They were committed in the British national interest in joining the European Union, as Stephen Wall's excellent book brings out very clearly. On political as much as on economic grounds, this was the only future for Britain that they saw. So that when they went into the renegotiation in 1974-5, they went against the background that they would do everything they possibly could, compatible with keeping the Labour Party together, to stay in. Is that the situation now? Or one doesn't think that when David Cameron makes the right noises now, he'd prefer to stay in, but there's a certain lack of conviction there, and the history of his views and of his associations don't necessarily support that.
Yeah, well, on the last point, I don't think I really want to comment very much, because we're, though we wouldn't think it, a long way away from discovering the answer, because of the fact that nothing much will happen between Wednesday's speech and the election in 2015, because the coalition government will not agree to initiate repatriation negotiations, as they were called. But dealing with your other points, I'm not sure I entirely agree with you. The financing arrangements for the European Community, which were made in 1970, were not only because of Britain. They were also very much part of what the French and the Germans saw as a basic deal. France got the CAP and the Germans paid. And of course, it's always worth remembering that the level of prices, which to some extent determined the cost of the CAP, was as much imposed by the Germans, who had a very uncompetitive agriculture, as it was by the French, who had a rather competitive agriculture, and would have accepted lower prices, but the Germans couldn't. And therefore, the Germans ended up paying for the high prices that they imposed themselves. The common fisheries policy, I think you were quite correct. It should never have happened in the way it did. It was really, when you look back on it, unbelievable that the Six should have drawn up a fisheries policy for 3 countries, 4 countries of course, because of Norway, which caught 4 times as much fish as they did. So it was an astonishing thing to have done, and it was an astonishing thing to have allowed to have happened. The British government, which of the day, which was the Wilson government, took its eye off the ball during the election campaign. I've said on several occasions, both in the foreword I wrote for the history of the negotiations and in this book, I actually think that if the British government had pulled out all the stops, they could have prevented the common fisheries policy being adopted the day before the accession negotiations opened. Why? Because there was one country, well, 2 countries, in the European community of the day who had no interest whatsoever in the fisheries policy. One was Luxembourg, for other obvious reasons, and the other was Italy, because the policy wasn't going to apply to the Mediterranean. So, and the Italians were amongst the strongest supporters of British membership. So I think if a prime ministerial message had gone to, I think it was Fanfani in those days, the Italian prime minister, and said, this is make or break, can you please stop this happening? It might have been stopped, but it didn't. It was the middle of an election campaign, and the ministers had other things on their mind. So that was a really bad story. But the others is a bit more nuanced than you said, I think.
Robert Morland, I'm a former member of the European Parliament. One feature, and I must say I appreciate so much of what you've said, and a lot of déjà vu for me, but one feature I remember, because I was a parliamentary candidate, Conservative candidate in 1974, was actually how little the issue of our membership of the EU appeared in both of those two elections that year. And if it was to anyone's advantage, it was actually to the Conservatives, because the anti-EU was so much associated with the left in the Labour Party, who really were the millstone around them, Castle, Ben, Shaw, etc. And I'm reminded of it because I was a candidate for county council at the same time as the general election in 2001, when William Hague put Europe pretty high up on what he was talking about. And I was very conscious going around that it was of disinterest to the public. And even at the last election, the one thing that always struck me was the one thing that was never held very much during that election against Gordon Brown, or really people didn't care too much about, was the fact that he didn't have the promised referendum on the EU. So what I'm really saying is one of the lessons of the past is really, when the chips are down, how interested are the public, from our experience, when it comes to the issue of Europe. And incidentally, can I just add that I think one of the main breaking points in the Conservative Party were the events of November 1990, and the fact that Mrs. Thatcher, was pushed out, and Europe was very much part of that, followed by, having everything quietened down, the Danish referendum, which really put forward, to the antis that you could win a referendum against Europe.
Yes, well, I think, I mean, the issue you raise of the relative importance in the British electorate's mind of the European issue compared with the health service or welfare or any of these other issues, that is obviously crucially important. And the evidence of recent polling seems to point to the fact that it still isn't a very high in the order of priorities, which is of course why those who want to see Britain leave have put all their faith in a referendum, because at least in a referendum you have to think about the subject. Although there is not the slightest evidence, looking at France or the Netherlands or anywhere else who's held referendums, or Ireland, that people in the referendum necessarily vote on the question that's on the voting paper. They much more often vote on whether they want to socket to the government of the day, or dislike the president of the day, or whatever it is. And I'm sure that would be the same with us. I think there are referendums like the one that will take place in Scotland that are probably fairly immune from that, because they are about something that everybody in Scotland recognises as an existential issue of their future. But I don't think a European referendum here would escape from being captured by other completely other issues. And of course the level of vote in a referendum is not necessarily very high either. Invariably, practically, I think, I'm right in saying, lower than at a general election. So that whole business of the relative importance hasn't changed a huge amount.
Of course, it is true that we have on the statute book an act that requires a referendum for any treaty that transfers any powers to Brussels.
Indeed, there is an act that is on the statute book that requires referendums in any of, I think, 65 different sets of circumstances, all of which would involve a transfer of powers to Brussels. So it would not be triggered by changes made by the Eurozone countries themselves, which do not involve any move of powers from Britain, which is why so much excitement is being stirred up at the moment about having what you might call a freestanding referendum, not one which is based on the 2011 Referendum Act.
Over there, and then I've got two more. I've got five now. Yes.
Hello, Millicent Scott from the European Parliament UK office. Thank you very much. Very interesting to hear about what happened 40 years ago. Another difference now, you've actually touched upon it already, is that the British people are not only going to be, potentially, asked to vote in this referendum about the European Union, but also the union of the crowns between Scotland and England. Seeing as people may and may not vote on the question put before them, what do you think could be the impact of one referendum, the EU one, on the other, the Scotland one, or rather the other way around?
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
Because the Scottish referendum is going to take place in the autumn of 2014, and there is very little likelihood of any referendum taking place on a European issue. But there are a whole lot of differences, so it's not very easy to be precise about it. Huge differences. Partly, the Scottish referendum is only in Scotland. The people of England, Wales and Northern Ireland are not going to be asked to vote on whether or not Scotland gets its independence. Only the Scots are going to be asked that. And so it's a completely different situation, and you can't draw parallels really, because it's clear that the electoral makeup of the electorate in England, in Wales, in Northern Ireland and Scotland is all rather different. To start off with, there are virtually no Conservative members in Scotland or Wales, and therefore the fever, as I call it, probably wrongly, that has infected the Conservative Party doesn't actually apply very much north of the border or west of the Offa's Dyke. I think it's difficult to say, except that I do believe that if it comes to appear that Britain is sliding towards a potential exit from the European Union, then I think the Scottish National Party will break open the single malls.
Yeah, Lord Rayburn.
John Rayburn, I saw these events from the House of Commons between 1970 and 1983, but I'm really only going to comment on one of the things which you raised, John, and that was the change of the Labour's Euroscepticism to the current Tory scepticism. I think a great deal of it can be summed up in the word social policy. I think it was Jacques Delors and then it being brought into the Maastricht Treaty, which was rather influential when he came and spoke to the TUC and so on. That was very influential in changing Labour attitudes. They began to see this wasn't a capitalist plot, but which was something whereby they could obtain certain social objectives which they weren't able to get in London. And therefore, equally opposite, Margaret Thatcher really hated that. And therefore, of course, got the opt-out from the Maastricht Treaty as far as the social chapter was concerned, because as she said somewhere, she wasn't going to have imposed upon her from Brussels things she managed to stop happening in Britain. And so when the Labour Party then repealed the opt-out from the social chapter in '97, this of course has further enraged the Conservatives.
Because Delors himself was always extremely tentative about the sort of social directives which the Commission proposed. I can remember, because I was permanent representative at the time, he scotched any number of bright ideas that came out of the Directorate General for Social Policy in the Commission, and which he just trod on. Because you have to remember that Jacques Delors had suffered a good deal from that sort of legislation when he was Minister of Finance in France, and indeed had been put through the ringer of, I think it was 2 or 3, I can't remember how many devaluations, as a result of some fairly defective policy making in the first 2 years of President Mitterrand's presidency, and he was certainly not a man who was going to allow that to happen to Europe. But he did, of course, certainly want to have more social policy than Mrs. Thatcher did, which was not, of course, too difficult.
But the funny thing is that if you go to Paris with its present government, you find a lot of people who think that the European Commission is a dangerously Anglo-Saxon liberal institution that is far too keen on free competition and stopping state aid, which is rather the opposite of what you hear in London.
Yeah.
But maybe it's always been like that. There were 2 over here. Should we take both of them? Starting there.
Thank you. It does seem that present attitudes are, to some extent, using the European Union as a whipping boy And switches in governmental attitudes or party attitudes seem to reflect that, if you look back as well. I noticed that the Prime Minister in his Guildhall speech said he would not be persuaded of the importance of the European Union because of the experience of civil war in Europe for centuries, but that he had been persuaded of its importance because of democracy and how it had brought democracy to Eastern Europe. I'm wondering if the leak from the Prime Minister's speech, which suggests that lack of democracy is one of the problems, is something that was faced up to in the time that you were there, and if you also experienced this use of the union as a whipping boy. It does seem to me that when I was in Convention on the Future of Europe talking about constitutional developments, that was one of the things that was being addressed. And if the country identified more and felt they had more influence over these things, perhaps you might find it more difficult for governments to behave as they have.
Yes, well,
Yes, carry on.
I have to say I noticed what the Prime Minister said about Eastern Europe and about the two world wars. And I'm afraid my only comment was that just shows that his own Secretary of State for Education is quite right. History isn't very well taught. He did take a degree in PPE rather than history, but I'm not sure that I would follow very far down the road you described.
Yeah, I'm Peter Wilding, Director of the Centre for British Influence, launching here a week tomorrow. Conservative Party has been mentioned quite a lot. Actually, the Conservative Party is mentioned quite a lot with confusion and perplexion, if that's such a word. I'd just like to ask David whether he sees the Conservative Party's ambitions as being part of the problem. And I'd just like to say two things. The Conservative Party has always been divided into three sections. I call the Tory nationalists and the Tory moderates and the Tory traditionalists. And it's quite clear that after two specifics, the 1982 Falklands War and the Maastricht Treaty, not including, as John says, the defenestration of Margaret Thatcher, has just fed into the Tory nationalist psychology. There's no question about that. But it's very sad in a way, because I'll just leave you with this. The Tory party has changed over the last 150 years. In 1846, with the Corn Laws, it was the party of the world and free trade. And it moved one step back to the party of the empire, with Chamberlain and tariff reform. And then it went back one stage to the party of the Commonwealth in 1932. And then, after the end of the empire, the party of Europe in 1973. And then, finally, the party of the UK alone, when it lost faith in Europe. And suddenly it became the party of England. And then the party of the South East, and then the party of London. What is the reason for this? Complete lack of ambition of the Conservative Party is probably the reason for the debacle in confidence that it's supposed to portray as a party of power and leadership. And I say that is probably the result of those three occasions, and a lack of ambition and the domination of nationalism as a concept again.
Well, I rather tend towards a slightly different interpretation, which is that I don't understand why it's come about, which is that the Conservative Party, having for a century or more been the party of pragmatism and power, has become highly ideological. Philip Stevens wrote a piece about this, I think it was, or Gideon Racklin, I can't remember which of the two, recently. I mean, it was put to me long before that by a very wise Belgian permanent representative who said to me, it is rather astonishing, he said, I was brought up at an English-British school to believe that pragmatism was the highest form of wisdom, and that this was the great British secret, and that all we continentals were forever being trying to fit things into written constitutions and get very hot under the collar about ideology. And he said, now, in the European project, the roles are completely reversed. And I think that is really quite important. On one tiny point, Peter, I would just say that, of course, the bit of the Conservative Party in 1846 that believed in free trade became the Liberal Party.
We're running a bit out of time. Should we take 2 or 3 questions? Could you take 2 or 3 questions, David? One.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. I really enjoyed your presentation. I just had one very straightforward question. I'm not sure the answer is straightforward, though. If you were still permanent representative, on the basis that the Conservatives won an overall majority at the next election and there's going to be a referendum, what would you be advising a Conservative Prime Minister about what he should prioritise and how he should go about repatriation or renegotiation?
Well,
should we take one more over here while you ponder that
okay.
one? And then there are going to be 2 over there to finish.
Anthony Simpson, former MEP. A couple of questions, David. The first is on the multi-annual budget. That, of course, now is governed by the co-decision procedure. The European Parliament will have some say. If you're right, then you are that some decision comes out in February from the Council. Do you think the European Parliament will have any great effect on it, or will it be bought off by another 0.03% or something to keep them happy? Or do you think they may seriously get a change into the multi-annual budget as part of the conciliation procedure? The second point is you said that between the speech and the election not much will happen. But domestically, I think the Europhobes are red in tooth and claw, and whatever Cameron offers will not be enough. They'll be asked for this, that and the other. There's already a motion in the 100 to want to have a binding referendum forced upon the next Parliament by this one, and so all this nonsense. And with the press backing them and so on, there will be a lot of anti-European stuff coming out through the fortified by the Euro elections. I happen to think the Scottish election may actually be beneficial because the in party, which is the one that keep Scotland in Britain, will be the one that wins, and they'll be pointing out the advantages of the European community. I think that is bound to see from the public consciousness. But on the other hand, it could be, we're now beginning to see a few Europhiles coming up the woodwork. Michael Heseltine, Tory's letter under Mike Rifkind, the Clark-Mendelsohn initiative, whatever that's going to be, and so on. And do you see basically a stronger anti-European move gripping Britain in the next 2 or 3 years, or do you think the Europhiles are going to get their act together a bit?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things there. First of all, your question. Well, the first part of the answer is they won't ask my advice. And the second part of the answer will, I'm afraid you'll have to wait till the 31st of January when we had to have a debate in the House of Lords on the Prime Minister's speech, and I might have something to say on that at that stage. But I don't want to get out ahead of that because I haven't seen the Prime Minister's speech. Yes. Just remind me, the first question, the multi-annual budget. Yes, I omitted, and I should have mentioned, that of course something that is new on this occasion is the co-decision power of the Parliament. And that could well be a quite major complicating factor, even if a deal is struck in February. On the other hand, I have the feeling that it has been such a painful process that there won't be a huge appetite for shipwreck at that point. So possibly, probably, the dealings between the Council and Parliament will be within fairly narrow parameters. But I only say possibly because I may be completely wrong. There no doubt are people in the Parliament who will argue that the best thing to do is to deadlock the whole thing and push the Union back to annual budgets because they'll get more money that way. But I think that in the present climate of opinion, that will not be a frightfully good cry to go into the European elections in 2014 with. So we'll have to see, but I admit to being not at all clear about how that dimension will play out. And the second point was
between now and 2015, will the Europhobes go strong or will the Europhiles go strong?
It's hard to be sure. It's hard to be sure. At the moment, there is the appearance, at least, of an awakening of the pro-Europeans who have been singularly passive and supine in recent years and have allowed the press and a lot of noisy politicians to walk all over them. How far that's going to carry things, I don't know. But certainly you can't have a proper debate if you don't have a lively pro-European as well as a fairly raucous Eurosceptic campaign going on. So we'll see. We will see. But I regard the events of the last 2 or 3 months as mildly encouraging, because I think something closer to a proper debate is now getting underway, with actual, real arguments being put forward. I don't know really where the Prime Minister will stand in all this, but let's wait until Wednesday and see what he says before passing judgment on that.
And let's just take the last two over there.
Hi, Tisha Kessler, I'm a Dutch reporter. It's a follow-up question on the last gentleman's question. You said after a referendum the Euroscepticism won't go away, but that sort of says the pro-European camp will win. What if the other camp wins, the get out of Europe camp? Do you think the Europhiles will sort of lay low, or will they start being a more vocal voice?
And the one behind.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm from Hanover Communications. I wanted to ask about the rise of nationalism in other member states, like Poland, for example, and what you think their role has been. And I'm sort of talking about the creation of the ECR in the Parliament, in the European Parliament, and if they have a role to play in this whole debate, and what role they have played.
Yes. Well, let's. You were quite right. I was talking about it won't settle it if there's a majority to stay in. I really find it difficult to predict that far ahead on if there were a majority to leave, because the process of leaving is going to be far, far more difficult and far worse than people currently think it would be. So I really wouldn't like to predict what would happen then, except I do not for 1 minute believe that the British government of the day could simply ignore a negative outcome or somehow massage it away. I don't think it would be like that at all. I don't think that is our tradition. So it would be very messy indeed, and I wouldn't like to predict what the final outcome would be. And no, I think, to be honest, I don't think the pro-Europeans would give up, but I don't know quite how they would manage in a situation like that. The rise of sort of nationalist right-wing parties, I don't think one should overdo that, frankly. They don't seem to me to be either anywhere near getting power or to be necessarily very durable. The history of right-wing parties in Europe since the Second World War has been pretty ephemeral. They do arise. There was a gentleman called Monsieur Poujade, who I am very familiar with because he came from the town where I have a house in the Lot. He was known as Le Papetier de Saint-Céré. And I once asked the man who ran the newspaper shop in Saint-Céré about Monsieur Poujade, and he said, "Il n'était pas un papetier proprement dit." I don't quite know what that was meant. It was certainly meant as an insult. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that Mr. Poujade disappeared without much of a trace, and it's quite a long time before the Front National reappeared. I think that one should be a bit cautious about over-interpreting this. The whole of Europe is going through difficult times now. The level of unemployment is high, unsustainably high, and so it would be really quite surprising if there were not fringe parties of both left and right prospering at this moment of time. Are they going to become part of a fixture? Are they going to become part of governmental coalitions? I think it's very doubtful.
Great. Well, I think that's a good moment at which to draw it to an end, and we'll have we'll need a drink basically. before we adjourn for a drink, I think we should give David a round of applause.